Hi, my name's Deborah Youdell, and I'm a professor of sociology of education. And the vast majority of my work throughout my career has been about social justice and inequality in education, and has been concerned with thinking about how inequalities come to exist, what are the social, pedagogic, policy, classroom-related things that create inequality in education. And one of the key things that I've looked at are the range of social identities that students and teachers bring into the classroom, social class, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, and how these become embroiled in educational processes in ways that create inequality. And part of that then is to say, how do we intervene as educators? How do we intervene in those processes to make education more equal? So that's been what I've been doing for about 20 years, I guess. And in the last few years, about the last 3 or 4 years, I've turned to work in the biological sciences to think about these questions. And what I've been doing is putting those two sets of ideas together to think about how we are biosocial and what that means for thinking about education. What I want to address, why might I want to claim that we're biosocial? What sorts of social and biological factors am I thinking about when I say that? And can we think about research and university projects that proceed along the lines of biosocial thinking? So the first thing then is to say we're biosocial. We live in social, cultural context, milieu. We operate in social institutions like universities, and we, at the same time, we have bodies. We have bodies that are functioning and that are feeling and that are doing the right or the wrong thing at any given moment, and they're there. And it's really self-evident, and yet the way we operate in education is often to imagine that we're not biosocial, but that we're just social, that we're sort of minds, that we think that what we do is all about the mind and the person, and the biological gets missed out. So, other direction, look. So, what sorts of factors am I thinking about? I'm thinking about things that are quite familiar for education, things like the curriculum in the classroom, the relationships between a teacher and a student, the policy that government makes and that an institution makes that frames how things work inside schooling. But what I'm also starting to think about are factors like nutrition and biochemical processes, and we start to get down to questions in analytical chemistry and molecular biology and neuroscience, when we start to think about how do brains function, how do cells function, what's the relationship between the functioning of the body, and what we can do. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about this. So let me remind you, I'm a sociologist of education. I don't have scientific training, and yet here I am with a slide that says epigenetics. Now, some of you might already know, but imagining you and me a few years ago when I started doing this work, epigenetics is a field of study that's looking at the way that the mechanisms that alter what genes do, but don't actually alter the genes themselves. I'm going to show you a diagram of this, and I'm going to hope to give you a flavour of why this is important. For me, it's just one area of biological sciences that I've been engaging with, but it's perhaps one of the ways into this idea of biosocial that's most helpful, and perhaps feels most profound, because what we're talking about is the way that environmental factors influence what genes make bodies do. So you'll see here, and this is a National Institutes of Health schematic to explain this process. You'll see in the top left the picture of a chromosome that most of us are used to. And then what the schematic does is kind of unravel that and look inside and start to say, what in fact is the chromosome made of? It's made of proteins and DNA and other things, and it's compressed into the shape of the chromosome through this spooling around. If you see the little blue discs, they're called histones, and the material is spooled around them, which makes some bits of the genetic code accessible and some bits inaccessible. And then we also have environmental impact on the material through a process called methylation. Again, the scientists can think about that, and the rest of us can just know that environmental processes create methylation. And what that means is that some parts of the DNA gets expressed, is there to use, has an effect. Another bit, so people talk about it being turned on and off, and there's a debate about whether that's a useful way to think about it, because off sounds very off. And part of what's really interesting about epigenetics is that these processes are ongoing. So sometimes epigenetics shows impacts, environmental impacts that last across generations. In other areas, epigenetics shows impacts which are quite short-lived and absolutely reversible. So if we think back to me as an educationist who's interested in social justice and who knows that for persistently we have an education system that's highly unequal, and often that inequality is taken as natural. People have natural intelligence. Educational success is particularly marked by race and social class. Poorer people and people from minoritized ethnic and racial groups generally do less well. The idea that any natural account of that might be challenged and that epigenetics might help us challenge that makes me start thinking there might be something useful for my project in this. Okay. So what I and my colleague Martin Lindley have done in the book that I was just showing you the cover of, what we've done in there is work through a whole range of evidence from sociology of education, from wider education studies and social science, but also from neuroscience, from analytical chemistry, from molecular biology, to say what is learning, and how does that work? And we're at the early stages of evidencing this. Where we're at really is a point of a synthesis of existing evidence and identifying the gaps and where we want to fill in with new data. So what we suggest is that we should think about learning as a complex biosocial phenomena. And to say that is to suggest a whole range of factors or forces that influence our capacities to learn. And if you look at this fan image that I'm offering to you, I've got a whole range of influences that we're suggesting influence learning. Some familiar: schools, policy, curriculum, pedagogy, subjectivity or identity. But then others that we might think are be less likely to associate with learning: sleep, relationships, nutrition, physical activity. And we also have here brain activity, cell functioning. Now, the first suggestion might be that all of these things have an influence on learning. But what we want to do is go further than that and say these things are entangled. There's a fundamental enfolding of these different sorts of factors that makes it really tricky to say these are the social influences and these are the biological influences, because actually as biosocial creatures we are simultaneously influenced by the biological and the social, and these things are folded together. So let me give you an illustration of that. If we think about feeling, and feeling in classrooms has been very much neglected kind of in the canon, in mainstream thinking about education, learning isn't about feeling. And increasingly there's been interest in feeling in classrooms and what it feels like to teach, what it feels like to learn. And what we want to say is what what are the biosocial entanglements that create feeling and inform or drive the influence of feeling on capacities for learning. And so what we're suggesting is that the feeling in a classroom is informed by the relationship of the teacher to the curriculum, the relationship of the students to the curriculum. Is it relevant? Do they recognise it? Have they learnt it already? Did they know it before? The pedagogy, is the pedagogy exciting? Is it stimulating? Is it hard? How do we feel about how it's hard? Are we frightened? Are we excited? Are we thrilled? What are the biochemical processes that are entangled with that flow into and flow from that? If we say that we feel something in learning, in psychoanalysis, we talk about learning as always an encounter with the new, and so learning is understood as unsettling, is going to cause discomfort, and the job of the teacher is to hold the student in mind. This is Winnicott for people who want to follow it up. You hold the student in mind so that they can experience this unsettling, discomforting new and still encounter it and move with it. So in that sense, I hope that you can see some of the ways that the biology of feeling discomforted, we actually feel that in our bodies. That's a sensation. It's affective, but that informs the way in which we might encounter a learning experience in a classroom. What we often do in education is we would look at that observationally or subjectively. We ask students, how do you feel? We ask the teacher, how do you feel? What we're starting to do is use techniques from analytical chemistry and bring mass spectrum analysis into the classroom and use the atmospheric, the chemicals in the atmosphere or from the exhaled breath of individuals to identify what sorts of feelings, what are the metabolic process of the body, and what do they tell us about the feelings in that classroom? And do those feelings facilitate learning, or might they block learning? It's just one example that I particularly like in the work that we're doing at the minute. One of the things that this promises to do is account differently for difference. We start with social justice and education, thinking about old categories like race and class and gender, sexuality, disability. I'm not suggesting we can get rid of them or that we should, that it's politically a good idea. But what thinking biosocially does is extend the sorts of parameters of difference that we might think about. We might think about particular spectrum of organic compounds in exhaled breath, which some students respond in this way, some students respond in that way. And there are a whole range of, obviously when we start thinking about genetics and genetic profiling, this becomes even more interesting and potentially problematic. And one of the key things that we need to do in thinking about the biosocial is think about what does it mean for what can be fair, what we understand as fairness, what's social justice, what does it look like when we start seeing particular intersections of old and new ways of thinking about difference, and what are the political imperatives on us in our research and in our pedagogic practice to ensure fairness. Okay. So I want to suggest then that we are biosocial and that that's absolutely inescapable, and that the project then needs to be to understand how we work collaboratively outside the parameters of the standard university disciplines and funding body disciplines, so that we can really understand what are those biosocial mechanisms and processes that are at play, and also understand how we ensure that those understandings and the uses of those understandings are for the better and not for the worse. Okay.